capacity, as you know, I'm appearing essentially as a former national security advisor.
Yes, understood. Thank you.
Thank you. So just on your question, the short answer is that AWS and autonomous weapon systems can enhance the combat power of our armed forces, just as previous technological innovations have over the past, several centuries, I guess, both offensive and probably particularly defensive. It means that we'll need to rethink doctrine and rethink the concept of mass. A parallel I have in mind is, for example, the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel, although having much smaller forces than their adversaries, were through better capability, better planning and doctrine, better training, able to prevail and prevail very swiftly. And AWS offers that opportunity to countries that adopt it and build these capabilities into their doctrines. The hazards, as you mentioned, are essentially, I think, Professor Darren White will know more about this than I, but are essentially the same issues that we've seen quite a lot of reporting on over the past few days about autonomous systems generally, which is essentially maintaining control. How do we ensure that they act only for the purpose and under the control that is set for them? How do we ensure that the rules of engagement that we apply to our armed forces now apply equally effectively to autonomous systems, particularly if those systems are having to operate as they might in a defensive capacity, essentially without very much human intervention, and I'm sure we'll explore those issues further.
You use the phrase "under the control of," which of course raises the question of the human in the loop and meaningful control. But I think we will indeed explore that in a bit more detail. Professor Darren White, thank you very much. I know you're joining us from Sydney, and although it's all black behind you, I hope it's not too inconvenient a time in the evening.
No, it's only 7 o'clock, so we're good.
Excellent.
But let me begin by, I guess, kind of just saying, to some degree, autonomy in weapon systems is a matter of degree. I used to give a presentation when I was in the UK showing that we actually had effectively an autonomous torpedo in 1897. Many of the components in that and the signal processing and so on were clearly done in an analog fashion, but nevertheless, once it had been released, it was autonomous. And we've had a whole series of those all the way through, if I might say. You look at something like today's modern missile systems, they are almost necessarily autonomous because things happen so fast, so quickly, in so many complex ways. You need to leave that weapon system to make its own decisions about what it thinks it's seen and what it thinks should do about what it sees. So I think it's very important to grasp that although we're talking about autonomous weapon systems now, they have been in existence and in use for a very long time. So it is not a new problem at all. I think the second thing that's probably worth pointing out before I head to costs and benefits, which is what you were talking about, is really trying to make the point that, I'm pleased we haven't used it yet, but I think one of the problems in the current age is that AI, or artificial intelligence and things like that, to a large degree, is just enhanced use of algorithms and data. Okay, it is not pixie dust. It is growth out of techniques that people like BAE Systems have been using for 50 years in lots of different applications. The way that images are processed, the way that targets are discovered, the way targets are identified, the way control is activated into the weapon system itself. All of these things, are to do with combined statistics, control, and a lot of other technologies that come together to deliver that. So we are on a journey, if you like, rather than a sudden leap into something that's completely different. I think it's important for the committee to appreciate that. I think the benefits are clearly there. We are being faced with threats now, which genuinely are really hard to engage. Hypersonic missiles, speed with which incoming systems are affecting you, there is no way of having a human in the loop. You have to have weapon systems which can identify, make good decisions, and combine all effects: electronic attack, cyber, as well as kinetic effect, in order to be able to guard against that sort of thing. So, exactly as was said, there's a huge role in defence. In fact, you could not have a modern defence system without that level of autonomy in my view. It's just, when we see attacks of thousands of drones at the same time, there is no way of protecting yourself other than using autonomous weapon systems in all of these sorts of things. And it's everywhere. So again, if I think of, underwater warfare, which is just a huge area, right? The data that you get back, acoustic information, it's not even addressable typically by a human. You have to have a machine understanding that signature. You have to have continuous contact with the enemy. You have to be able to deploy, play games, the whole sort of thing, at a speed and at a tempo which is just not possible with human engagement. So I think that's important. The other part of it, which I think is challenging, is the offensive component. And I think also we sometimes, when I think of the offensive component, there is this thing where you're clearly launching a kinetic effect or whatever, but the biggest thing at the moment, the biggest thing that's growing in this area is not kinetic effect, it's cyber effect. It's a general electronic warfare domain, it's attack using radars, attack on communication, it's influence, it's whole ranges of other things. It's how you influence the enemy and the population in so many different ways. And again, this is an enormously complex area, and yet in some senses it's the least impactful. If I can go out there and spread disinformation and attack using that content and disrupt communications and all of these sorts of things, exactly the kind of thing, in fact, we have been seeing in the Ukraine, and indeed the MOD have wargamed in the Ukraine. It is exactly the effect that you wish to achieve. And so again, it's hard to get away from that degree of autonomy that's necessary. Having said that, coming back to the earlier comment, I do think there is a supervisory role. Absolutely there is. You don't just go in and disrupt someone's communication or jam GPS or fly in some kinetic effect. There is genuinely a supervisory role in that process. And at some level, there needs to be the right authorities to make that happen. And certainly the challenges when I was in the MOD were a lot to do with the fact that the regulatory systems for that type of effect, including autonomy, are so very different than what they are for guns or kinetic effect or anything like that. And I think the committee here has to deal with that disconnect in a significant way.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Lord Hamilton of Epsom.
Yes, thank you very much. At the risk of being pedantic, surely autonomous means that there is no human intervention. And therefore to talk in terms of having the human in the loop and that sort of thing is actually a contradiction in terms. When it comes to the supervisory role, presumably within the military hierarchy, somebody's got to be responsible for this system, but the bottom line on that is that their responsibility is one of pulling it if it's not doing the function for which it was originally designed.
Lord Sedlow, or either of you, please go ahead.
No, I think that's right, and Professor Durham White has essentially addressed part of that already. That the human intervention is in setting, as I mentioned, essentially the rules of engagement and determining when systems should be applied and in what circumstances. Once engaged, the systems will be autonomous. Now, as Professor Durham White says, there are degrees of autonomy. They could be completely autonomous. One might, in order to deal with, for example, a swarm attack by multiple hypersonic drones, it would simply, as he said, be impossible for humans to be directly engaged in that. And so one would actually just have essentially a monitoring system that was capable of responding. The issue there, as is so often the case, is ensuring that we can distinguish, and the system can distinguish with complete confidence and reliability between friend and foe. But one might have essentially an entirely autonomous system doing that. I think in the offensive, one would want to have much closer human control making choices about the systems that are deployed. The other thing we should keep in mind is that not all military operations are peer-to-peer combat. These systems will be mostly of most use in those circumstances. But if you think of the counterinsurgency campaigns of the past 20 years, or other interventions engaging the military, in those cases there will be systems with some autonomous capabilities supporting the troops on the ground, identifying threats and so on. But in the end, we will still need people to engage with other people in order to achieve our objectives. And so we shouldn't. It's easy, I think, to get caught up in the kind of Terminator Matrix world as one is thinking about this. But actually, it's going to be a much broader spectrum of usage.
And presumably, setting the criteria is a really important element in terms of the application of international humanitarian law.
Indeed. But I think if one looks at AI generally, and of course the Prime Minister is currently in Washington talking about the broader questions of AI, one could think back. Professor Darren White mentioned autonomy goes all the way back to the 19th century. Essentially, the rules around the use of AI were probably best defined by Isaac Asimov in 1942 with his 3 laws of robotics. Law 1, a robot, and of course by that word, one now applies it to a much broader range of capabilities, but can't injure or through inaction allow injury to come to a human. Law 2, they must follow orders as long as that doesn't conflict with Law 1. Law 3, they can protect themselves as long as that doesn't conflict with Laws 1 and 2. Those laws would form a pretty good basis if they could be designed in and audited and so on for AI more generally and deal with many of the risks that have been identified in some of the coverage recently, including raised by some of the tech companies involved in this. Of course, those don't really work in exactly that way if one's dealing with autonomous weapon systems, because they are designed to have lethal effect, and therefore what we would need to do is alter the order, if you like, and be sure that we could build into those systems in a reliable way that couldn't be amended, that could be audited, maybe even by another AI system, that any system that we're deploying, both defensive and offensive, was following precisely the rules of engagement intended by the human command.
Fine, thank you. Professor Darren White, and then I'll come to Lord Horton.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. Again, I'll emphasise, I think, autonomous weapon systems, it's a matter of degree. You have them already. You have to follow procedures and so on to launch a missile. You have to follow procedures to launch a torpedo and all these sorts of things. So it's there. It's really an issue of the degree to which you make decisions and the degree to which you intervene in that and the degree to which you allow things to progress, according to a computer-based decision rather than a human-based decision. So again, I kind of want to emphasize it's there already. It's not pixie dust. It's very much the process of thinking logically through what's the right thing to do. I mean, if you, for example, needed genuinely to suppress an air defense system, let's take that as an example, all right? You have a range of options to do that already in lots of different ways. Whether you choose to apply those in an autonomous way or whether you choose to apply those, in a more supervised way, in the end, the commander makes those decisions now, but he himself is supervised by political decisions. And I think, it's just a flow-on from that, in my view.
Thank you.
New tool sets, I will agree.
Lord Brown of Ladyton.
Yeah, so, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Professor Dunn, I just want to explore some of the things. A couple of the things that you've said, I was intending to ask a different question, but you've encouraged me to think about this one. Of course we have autonomy. I mean, we've had autonomous weapons for a long period of time. I mean, the very use of the word ballistic implies that we're no longer in control of a weapon on re-entry from space or wherever. Right. So, I mean, what we're particularly interested in is AI-enabled weapon systems, rather than just autonomy in itself. We're particularly interested in weapon systems that are enabled by a technology that, to a degree, learns as it goes. I mean, it may not give you the same answer 2 days in a row to the same question, because it's non-deterministic. So that's what we're interested in. And are you saying that is just a linear progression of what we've been doing all along the line in terms of autonomy? And the second point I want to make to you is, you described to us, I think very graphically, what you thought modern warfare was like, right, in terms of technology. So we've all just lived through, and we're living through, the extension of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine that happened in February of last year. So we were promised by a lot of experts that we were going to get the first Cybergeddon. This was, and it just didn't manifest. It didn't manifest at all. So actually, our most immediate experience of the most significant conflict that many of us have seen in our lives is that this is not how we conduct warfare in the 21st century, actually, and that artificially enabled weapons will be a significant shift from what we've seen up until now.
Who would like to take that?
First question.
Professor.
I apologise. I apologise for interrupting. Please, my colleague go first.
So I mean, have I got this wrong? Have I misunderstood you, or is that what you were telling us? The way I've described it, or have I mischaracterised it?
No, but let me address your questions. All right. I think the first thing is around AI. I think one of the problems with AI, as I said at the beginning, is that we actually call it AI. Because if you write code, and I've been working on AI for 40 years, essentially AI is applied statistics. All right. Because what you do is you basically take data in, you have to process that data and convert it into decisions, whatever they may be. And most of those decision makings are what I think of as standard statistical techniques. They are Bayesian methods, neural networks, as an example, were invented in 1957. These are not new technologies, right? We've been using them for a long time. And we process images, we bring that data together, we use that data to make decisions. And that's essentially what AI is. And even if I come to things like large language models, which people are all talking about at the moment, if you dig into how they work, all that's really happening is the next letter, the choice of the next letter is a probability on which letter is most commonly seen on the internet, associated with that phrase you just put in. It is statistics, okay? And I do worry sometimes that people think AI is somehow magic. It's completely different from everything we did in the past. It isn't. The big thing that's changed, of course, is we have lots of data and lots of compute power, and we can do hugely different things than we have ever done before. Design molecules, predict disasters, etc. But it's because of that. It's not because there's something fundamentally different about AI from anything else. So yes, it is a progression. Okay, it might be a steep line in the sense of our compute power, our ability to get data and everything else, but nevertheless, it is a straight line. I genuinely do not feel that what we are seeing today is anything different than when I first worked on AI in the when I was 20 back in the 80s, right? We can do much more, but it's otherwise fundamentally the same. That doesn't mean we can't do lots and lots and lots with it. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it isn't powerful. But it isn't fundamentally different. I think that's important. Let's come back to Ukraine and other things like that. On the contrary, we are seeing drone technology. We are seeing guided missile technology. We're seeing guided shelling and targeting in lots of different ways. So we are seeing a lot of instances of autonomy applied to warfare. I have to say I'm surprised as you at the cyber side of things. And I'll come back and say, when I was at the MOD, we wargamed the Ukraine situation. Because it was one of the things we were worried about even then. And we believed that would happen. We would believe, for example, also that Russia would have air dominance, but it hasn't. And no one really appreciated, I guess, that things were perhaps not as much as we thought they were going to be. But if I go to other jurisdictions, Israel as an example, China as an example, cyber warfare is here and present in spades. Okay, in spades. It's making a huge difference.
Do you want to add to that?
I think there's just one point I'd make in response to Lord Brown's question. I think in this kind of discussion, it's probably helpful for us to try and make a distinction between essentially the tactical and the system. because a lot of what we're talking about here has been individual autonomous weapons. And essentially the use of autonomy at the tactical level. And I think what Lord Brown is driving at is what happens if and when we reach the conclusion that we want, because of the speed of response, the need to have essentially a comprehensive response, whether that's defensive or offensive. It's when we hand over essentially the command and control system to an algorithm, as opposed to that being the individual decisions being made by commanders. I think distinguishing between autonomous weapons, which, as we've said, of which there is a long history and where it's linear, I think there is a step change in my view. There would be a step change if, for example, we said, right, in order to deal with, for example, the ballistic missile defence issue in the UK, of which we don't have very much at the moment, as you know, we're going to have essentially an entirely automated system that's going to identify friend or foe, that's going to be able to launch, etc. And the political decision is to develop that, but you're allowing the whole thing to be automated. And that is a qualitatively different thing to individual autonomous weapons. And I think it's probably useful just to make that distinction.
I've got an eye on the clock. We might need to perhaps come back to some of those issues a little later. But Lord Horton of Richmond.
Hello, Mark. It's Nick Horton here. Can I ask a question that primarily draws on your experience as National Security Advisor in setting national risks? And Professor, you might want to comment then on what Mark comes up with. It seems to me that the committee has been very much bounded in looking at artificial intelligence within weapon systems, when these are weapon systems that, if you like, exist above the threshold of formalised warfare. My argument there is consistently that these can be dealt with by purely extensions to our systems of regulation of the battlefield, in which, for some time to come, the introduction of meaningful human control will be an element. But from the perspective of national risks, there are an awful lot of artificial intelligence-enabled, if I can pompously call them vectors of attack, between countries, which exist below the threshold of formalised warfare, and get at things like alternate truths, fixing elections, the denial of food, energy, infrastructure, power systems, and all of these represent far greater risks to the country below the threshold of formalised warfare. I know, Mark, you're not currently NSA, but going back to your time in attempting to set these things, do you actually think that artificial intelligence poses far greater risks to the countries in this non-kinetic sense, and that we need to know this to sort of situational, to put our study in context, as it were, as opposed to things which actually are no more than an extension of current frameworks that either ban, treaty limit, or regulate their employment?
So yeah, I think that's right. I think if I were writing this into the National Risk Register now, I probably wouldn't have it as a single risk for the reasons you set out, Nick, Lord Horton, sorry. Because in some areas, it's essentially an enhancement of the existing risk. We know that there is a risk of cyber attacks that could disrupt our mobile communication systems and so on. And applying more sophisticated techniques through machine learning, quantum, et cetera, to those threats means that we have to probably raise the level of our defences against that risk. Risk in the end is essentially a pretty simple equation. It's threat minus capability, and if the threat goes up, you have to improve your capability. Otherwise, your risk goes up. And so, if we're worried about that, we would be right to be. It would be essentially, what are the enhancements to some of the risks that already exist, disruption to mobile communications, power supplies, etc., that you've mentioned, that new technologies, including machine learning, could present. There'll be some areas like deep fakes in elections and communications, which they probably haven't made it through the threshold to the National Risk Register in the past, because the capability hasn't, the technology hasn't really existed to enable that that to happen. So there is some risk of that kind, which probably should now break through to the national register, because the technology means that those risks, or at some point will, the technology means those risks are real. But what I would tend to want to look at, I think, is I'd want to look at it is so risk by risk, if you like, and ask, are there new risks, or does this enhance the potency of some of the existing ones?
Professor, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I have to say I agree with Lord Horton there very much. I suspect in the autonomous, what we think was the kinetic weapon area or this sort of thing, can largely be dealt with through an extension of the rules-based order that we currently have. I mean, I agree there are issues to consider. Having said that, where we have no real understanding of the potential risks is in these areas which are around influence, around attack of civilian structures, and these sorts of things. And I think AI has a very, very large role to play in that. Despite what I said about it being applied statistics, you only have to look out there to see what's happening in terms of influence, fakes, a whole range of different things. And to be honest, the impact it does have on the public, that it would be a real concern. And I have to say also, our experience when I was at the MOD was our adversaries are much better at this than we are. Because I think there are different ways that we have dealt with it in the past. So I think it is a challenge, and I think it is a risk that's worthy of real consideration in terms of autonomy and AI.
Our adversaries are better at it than we are. What are the fields, what are the methods that are giving them the edge?
I would argue that some of the advantage they have is that they are not regulated in any way. They're more than happy to put up groups that can go out and attack at will organisations, companies, public, influence elections, and so on. I don't think the government here would ever allow us to influence someone else's election.
Right, that's a sobering answer. Thank you, Lord Sedwell.
Just to give you an example, which was not particularly AI enabled, but it will give you a sense of what could happen after the Salisbury attack. We had a single narrative, very largely, which was based on the investigation, the truth of the fact it was a GRU operation. The Russians did not counter that with a single counter narrative. We used a narrative counter narrative. They didn't do that, partly because they didn't have a credible one. So what they did was sought to confuse, and I think at one point we reckoned that there were about 24 alternative narratives out there being promulgated on social media and through the mainstream media by the Russians, not because they believed that any one of them was going to essentially defeat our narrative, just simply create enough noise that our narrative was lost particularly in the areas they were seeking to influence, which was not our population, but the populations of much of the rest of the world, if you like, the non-aligned world. And now one could imagine that happening in a much more sophisticated, targeted, sort of industrial scale way, if enhanced by modern AI techniques. And I think that sort of subversion has been on the National Risk Register forever, long before there was even a National Risk Register. But there are qualitative differences, I think, of that kind in this counter-narratives, deep fakes and so on, that we are going to have to address. And we can't address by doing the same ourselves. We've got to find a way of sticking to our values, but making sure that we're effective in promulgating our narratives, our values, our principles.
Lord Treesman, do you want to come in on this?
Lord Chairman, thank you, and thanks to the two witnesses as well. I suspect this is principally a question for you, Lord Sedwell, but I'd like to try and peel back another layer on the additions or potential additions and multiple additions to the National Risk Register. In a previous select committee, which I had the privilege of being on, which dealt with existential risk and looked at that, among the existential risks which were considered, especially by Lord Mayor, who's an eminent engineer, was the accidental risk that occurred when a dam overtopped. I'm not choosing the example because of events of the last 72 hours, but that was one of the risks. The secrecy which surrounds the National Risk Register is understood. One doesn't want to advantage people who have malign intent. But it's also true that people have to respond to a risk that may occur and then occurs. They have to be forearmed in order to be able to do that effectively. In the event that there are now some other things which should be in the National Risk Register, maybe not just one, but maybe several things, who should be in on the secret? Who do we need to know what those risks are in order to try and deal with them? Because it being locked in a room in Westminster may not be a solution to anything.
Thank you. Thanks, Lord Treasman. Thanks, David. I essentially agree with the premise that you put forward there. The current, or certainly when I was National Security Advisor, the procedure for the National Risk Register was that there was a national security risk assessment and so on, which is confidential, and then a version of that is published every couple of years or so as an open National Risk Register for first responders, etc., throughout the country. And I think actually another Lords Committee, I think the one on did a report on resilience a year or two ago. And I rather agree with their view, which is the primary document should be the open, unclassified one, the National Risk Register, with a classified annex for those things that are genuinely classified national security risks, and we should sort of essentially turn that around. And then, of course, the issue is, okay, how do you follow up, as you've indicated? And if we conclude that there's a major biosecurity risk, or there's a major there are risks, as you suggested, to dams or to our power systems or communications and so on, then we simply have to find a way of engaging the experts and including, of course, in many areas, the private sector, as well as local councils and local responders, etc., in the contingency planning to deal with that. And actually, that is not as complex sometimes as we think. You don't necessarily have to reveal the underlying intelligence sources and so on in order to be able to engage people in thinking through the contingency planning and indeed identifying the capabilities that we would need. Sometimes what the intelligence will tell you is that a risk that in a sense is self-evident is actually more potent than we might have thought, or less potent than we might have thought. But the risk itself is probably something that any reasonably well-informed expert would be able to identify.
Professor, does that accord with your view?
Yes, and I have no more useful than that. That's good.
I'd go to Lord Brown very briefly before we move on to the UK on the global stage.
I mean, this is not a question, it's just a fact. I mean, the last risk register, which was published in 2020, has one mention of AI in it, in the context of new technologies, which it describes as being probably causing shifts in and this is a quote, the nature of how we work in the future, and it warns that we in the UK must be aware of these changes and work through the implications on people and businesses in the coming years. So that's what we currently have in the context of AI. And this comes from a piece of journalism and in a national newspaper. Apparently the Cabinet Office told those journalists on the 6th of June that the government will publish the updated National Risk Register soon. So we may know, what presence it has very quickly.
Soon has a number of interpretations in the parliamentary and political vocabulary.
Like shortly, yes.
Shortly, in due course.
In due course, yes.
Or something, yeah.
May I come to the Lord Bishop of Coventry?
Thank you, Lord Chair. And as you said, if we continue the theme in many ways, the UK on the global stage. It's really a question about capabilities and whether we're using those capabilities well, responsibly, and whether we're exerting good influence. Lord Sedwell, you referred to the Prime Minister in Washington He's reported to have said these words. I think this was actually on the plane to Washington. You would be hard-pressed to find many other countries other than the US in the Western world with more expertise and talent in AI. We are the natural place to lead the conversation. I wondered whether you both agreed with that, generally perhaps, but also in terms of its application to AI and weapon systems. And if you do you feel that we're using our capabilities well, and by that I think I mean responsibly, and how far can we influence others to use AI and weapon systems well, responsibly? And do you see evidence of that which has been claimed in written evidence we were given on Monday from the MOD of the UK promoting values-based norms and standards for military AI, particularly in the light of Professor Derrant-White's comment about other jurisdictions, some other jurisdictions being less sensitive to rules and regulations. Thank you.
I might leave Professor Derrant-White to comment more on the sort of skills and talent in the UK. I believe actually we are in pretty good shape there, but he will know that better than I. And of course, he's sitting in Australia, which is pretty good at this as well. And he will have more to say on that than I. I think on the general point you make, Bishop, is essentially about doctrine in this area. And I think we are going to have to look at doctrine, and Lord Horton will have views on this as well. But actually, so there is something about setting rules and standards for the use of all weapon systems, and certain weapon systems, chemical weapons, etc., have been banned. We shouldn't assume, by the way, that AI will necessarily make all weapons more dangerous. In many cases, they'll make them more precise, and therefore we should be able to minimize combat casualties, at least on our own side, and civilian casualties on our adversaries' side. And so there are actually humanitarian, in international humanitarian law, there should be benefits to the use of AI, as well as, of course, enhancing combat power if done properly. But all of the other elements of doctrine will have to be brought into this. Deterrence, because of course, we will set rules and standards for ourselves as we do in all other areas of defence and rules of engagement and so on. But we can't be absolutely confident that every other country will do so. So there will need to be defence and deterrence. And there will probably be a role for arms control agreements as well, with verification mechanisms too. And those verification mechanisms will be very different to human inspectors walking around and looking at sites the way they did in the past, and counting missiles and so on. It will have to be sort of verification of code. If a country says, yes, actually, we have applied unamendable code sitting at the heart of our AI defense systems, that means that they aren't fully autonomous, they can't get out of control, they will only do what we want for them. It will probably have to be some kind of AI audit of that code that will tell us whether indeed that is the case. But these are concepts, in a sense, as I think both of us have been arguing, that at least that we are familiar with. We just have to apply them in the new context. Defence, deterrence, arms control, verification, all of that should enable us to have a framework that we can be confident of in this new era.
Professor?
So I'll deal with the skills part of it. Look, I think the first thing to recognise is, arguably 98% of what's going on in computer science and AI is not in defence. It's in the civilian sector. It's in commercial products and things like that. And defence, truthfully, is a latecomer to the game in terms of what's generally happening. I think when you look at what's going on globally, without question, China is investing arguably twice as much of everyone else put together. And I think we need to recognise that. It genuinely has gone to town. If you look at the patents, if you look at the number of publications, if you look at the companies that are involved, it really is quite significant. And yet, I think it's important to point out that the US is still dominant in the area by a long way. It's got more innovation, it's got fantastic companies, and the big breakthroughs, ChatGPT being the latest one, come from actually the US typically rather than China. The UK, though, does really punch above its weight in a lot of different areas in AI. There are some fantastic companies, like DeepMind would be a very good example, but I can name lots of others that are genuinely changing the game in the AI area, stuff that's never been done before anywhere. And arguably their impact is much more than all the things that are going on in China at this point. So I think the UK needs to be proud of what it does in that area. You could pick very specific niches like, say, computer vision, where the UK leads the US, in fact, I would argue, in that area. So the UK kind of needs to have its capabilities and be world-class in those, and world-class really matters in this domain. Being second best is not. But on the other hand, like everything in security and defence, a lot of it's about our international collaborations. The fact that we do collaborate with the US and Australia and other places is critical, and Europe, the rest of Europe as well, to the fact that we can maintain a significant lead, both not just in what we might do in weapon systems, but in commercial systems as well. And I think it's important to understand that. I do worry a little bit that the UK's falling behind in terms of its investment in that kind of technology. But nevertheless, it really does hold its own in a lot of key areas, both corporately and in academia.
Thank you very much. Lord Hamilton, briefly, and then I'll go to...
Yes, Steve, very briefly. You mentioned international collaboration. Of course, the Prime Minister is talking to the United States about AI systems, which presumably in the civilian sector. But of course, there's a direct read over to defence systems. He's talking to we're talking in terms of the EU, China, and the United Kingdom. The notable exception is Russia, who I don't think would ever cooperate on anything like this. Where do you see these talks going? And is there a read over? If you're going to have a regulatory body dealing with the civilian sector, could it actually deal with defence as well?
Professor.
Mark, are you going first?
Oh.
Me first. Okay.
As you like.
Happy to. Thanks, Lord Hamilton. I think, to be honest, it's very difficult to see how any international regulatory body could be effective in regulating autonomous weapons systems, not least because it would require a whole range of capabilities around verification and so on that would essentially skew its entire work. So I think, just as in other areas, I'd need to give this some more thought. I haven't really thought about this a great deal, to be honest. So I apply that health one. But I think a body that essentially tries to set for the civilian world a set of systems of norms and guarantees, whether based on Asimov's laws or something similar, but that'd be a pretty good place to start, I would have thought. Should really focus on that, and that, as Professor Durrant-White has said, is 98% of what's going on in this world, and a lot of that will be around questions such as should AI systems go through some kind of trial or pilot before they are launched at industrial scale. That suggestion about essentially applying the same kind of approach that we apply to drugs trials, should that be applied to AI, particularly if it's operating, if we're using AI techniques in terms of medical innovation and so on. And it feels to me that trying to include defence in a body that's helping to set standards and norms for all of that, the way that we would in many other areas of activity, would probably skew its work. I think where we're talking about weapon systems and defence and AI systems, as I mentioned earlier, the strategic as opposed to the tactical, that is probably better done through an adaptation of the existing arms control and other strategic mechanisms.
Professor.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. In the civilian area, just picking that, I think there are two pieces. I mean, I think it's very hard to regulate the development of algorithms and innovation in that sense. I just can't actually imagine how you'd do it. I think there's a lot to be said for regulating the way data is used. And I can see someone coming in and saying, this needs to be tested against a number of different communities or a number of different outcomes, the same way that you would run a clinical trial. I think that makes sense, and you have some product assurance associated with it. But at the algorithmic level, you can always take, as you can in many technology fields, take something that's approved for one job and use it to the detriment of people in another way. And that is very, very hard to regulate. I can have an algorithm for recognizing friends and images and use it for targeting people, for example. And you cannot, it's very hard to see how you would control it at that fundamental level. So I think we need to be a little bit more the way, perhaps, exactly as Mark said, around medicines and things like that, maybe the best possible approach. And I think regulating in the civilian domain is probably achievable. Regulating in the military domain would be much harder, much, much harder.
Thank you. Bishop, you set us going on this area of questioning, and I rather cut you off. Do you have a supplementary before I go to Baroness Hodgson?
Well, yes, it's very interesting and reassuring to hear Professor's confidence in our skills and capabilities here. I just wondered whether you could say something more about the values approach and whether you see the excellence which you have described. Is that excellence something to do with a values based? And if I may, this is sort of related to it, but I wondered if I could just come back also to that expression that Lord Sedwill used of unamendable controls, which I think is related to the values based. You build in unamendable controls which reflect that. The thought that just sort of leaves me with is whether that concept of unamendable controls is one that is going to stand the test of time as AI develops at pace. And is that what some of the scientists and sort of manufacturers and inventors, as it were, are saying at the moment, that actually that might not be possible in the future?
Lord Sedwill.
Well, so it's a great question, and to be honest, I'm now beyond my own area, beyond my own area of expertise. So I mentioned Asimov's laws because I think that's the earliest crystallization of the kind of principles that should be built in to dealing with autonomous artificial computer systems and so on. As I say, it comes from a short story written in 1942. And the point I was making, but this is where people with much greater expertise would have to work out exactly how one would do it, is I think as policymakers, something of that kind is what I would be looking for, is saying, okay, assure me that sitting at the core of particularly any genuinely autonomous systems, I think where we're talking about autonomous general intelligence as opposed to individual AI applications to unwind DNA, etc., and create new drugs, but autonomous general intelligence, so AGI, which is the issue again we're sort of touching on here, and we've got to be quite clear about the difference between the tactical and the strategic. That I think I would want to be assured that before any system of that kind were sort of allowed out of the lab, if you like, that there was an auditable assurance that something like those three laws was built in. It can't harm through action or inaction. It will always follow instructions, etc. Now, as Professor John White says, that may be phenomenally difficult to do. But in a sense, I think that's the task we should set to the tech industry and say, if you wish to continue to pursue all of the potential for human welfare of these new technologies, you have to build in some safeguards, and safeguards of that kind must be safeguards in which we can have complete confidence. Not just statistical confidence, but complete confidence.
Thank you.
And I think that's a challenge we have to put over to the people who are developing this. Is there a way of essentially ring fencing some code or whatever it might be? As you can tell, I'm way beyond my area of expertise here. That couldn't be amended, and that would essentially set boundaries to how an autonomous system, essentially learning and evolving in its own sense, would set boundaries to how it might operate.
Professor, very briefly.
Yeah. Look, there are two issues here. One, let's pick self-driving cars as an example. Even this morning, there was something about Tesla running over a dog. The problem is the number of cases is infinite, and you cannot test a piece of code, no matter how much you test it, to guarantee it'll work everywhere, every time, in every circumstances. It's just technically not a possible thing to do. Okay, and I think I think you need to step away from that. There are two, however, other ways that people do try and approach it. The current way, and even in things like ChatGPT, it is open code. Everyone gets to look at it. Everybody gets to check it. And that code evolves. A good example would be Unix, which is the standard operating system people have now used for 50 years. Because it's open source, it is almost indestructible, because people have worked on it for so long and checked it in so many different ways, and it's open and so on. And I think UK companies particularly, and UK academics are really good at this in the AI area. You'll find almost everything is open source. And I think that's a fantastic way of implementing what Mark suggested at a pragmatic level. However, there is an opportunity, and there are groups working on this, and we tried to work on this when I was at MD, of actually formally, mathematically, proving that an algorithm does only this and no more, and providing an absolute guarantee using a mathematical process rather than a test until it breaks process. And that is, in the future, the only way that we will get these things right, okay? But it is only an emerging discipline. And I think we need to understand, that won't happen in the near future, but it is the way things will need to be done in the future.
Thank you. Lord Sedwill, you're under pressure of time, I know, as are we. Are you both able to stay with us for another 10 or 15 minutes? Excellent.
I have to exit on the hour, so...
Right. Well, I think take your leave of us at the time you have to take your leave of us, but see if Baroness can squeeze her question in while we still have you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. We've slightly touched on elements of this question, but it's really there's obviously been a lot of publicity nationally and internationally about AI. And is the language of an arms race in AI development useful? And to what extent does the development of AI-powered weapons by hostile powers create a compulsion to develop and deploy such systems? And in that context, how reliable is our information about what other states are developing?
Lord Sedwill.
Why don't we I can stay for another 10 minutes, so why don't we let Professor Derwent-White have a go before he has to drop?
Yeah, Professor.
I do think AI is hugely overhyped at the moment. I think, again, I'll go back to something I said at the very beginning. I think you need to be careful, because we use the word AI. If we use the word advanced statistics instead, people would not get so hyped up about it. And I think that's a challenge. And if you go back historically, the reason the word AI was invented was actually a group at MIT was trying to flog a project to defense in the US. That's back in the 50s. That's why it's there. So we need to be careful. It's not quite what you're suggesting. And other countries are developing these things, but we are as well. It is a progression in lots of these different areas. And it's not something that's suddenly changed and is suddenly magic. It's just a progression of algorithms, data, larger compute, better sensing, all of these things, precision, as Mark said, I think, and they can actually bring benefits, not just negativities associated with it. I think that's important to understand as well. So please don't think that somehow AI is changing the game. It isn't. And I really worry about the hype that's going on in the press at the moment.
As the clock is about to strike the hour, not only in London but in Sydney, can I thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been really useful.
Thank
I'm
you very
most
much.
grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Lord Sedwill, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I agree with Professor Derwent-White there, but I think this is true of all developments in weapon systems, that it is possible to compensate for inadequate capacity through better capability. I mentioned the example of the Six-Day War in 1967, where the much smaller forces of Israel outfought their adversaries because they had more sophisticated capability, including human capability. They were better trained and so on. And so, of course, whereas some countries can simply use mass, we, the UK, as one of the leading, but obviously below the top handful of powers in terms of sheer scale and mass, can't afford to fall behind. So we must continue to innovate in this area as we innovate in others. And I would argue we should try and make that a source of competitive advantage in defence compared to others. There's been an awful lot of speculation recently about the size of the army in Europe and so on. Well, actually, in the AI world, the number of troops may be much less relevant than how much combat enhancement for each troop or each system or each individual is available to them. So we have to stay competitive in this area. I think the other point I'd just make, just to echo a point Professor Durrant-White made, is I do think that the big qualitative shift in defence doctrine in the past century was the development of nuclear weapons. And I don't think we should see AI as being as significant as that, in that that completely changed doctrine because of the concept of mutually assured destruction and so on, and therefore wars that could not be fought. AI may, as it enhances systems, may make that issue more potent, but I don't see another step change of that kind coming as a result of it. It may just be that particular step change it becomes even more relevant than it was back in the 1940s.
Thank you very much. Lord Mitchell.
Yes, I was. The statistic which came up, which really surprised me, was that 98% of all AI is not in the defence sector, meaning 2% is. So I'm really surprised by that. And I just wonder, does the UK government engage effectively with private industry? And perhaps Lord Sedwell, you're in a very key position to comment on that, in developing AI systems. And is their approach to policy making capable of keeping pace with the speed of AI development?
So again, I'm not an expert on this, Lord Mitchell, but I think the effort is clearly there. You have the Defence MOD have just issued their paper, Ambitious, Safe, Responsible, setting out their approach to this. You've had evidence from BAE Systems, and of course, that is that their research in this area is partly internal, but partly driven by demand. The 98% statistic was one who actually was new to me as well. So actually, just for the record, from Professor Durrant-White, but it sounds it probably is right, given the degree to which AI is being used in all sorts of areas. Machine learning, actually, is probably a better way of describing it. It's being used in all sorts of areas to enhance capability. And if we think in defence, we've been thinking about this for several years. So, for example, doing autonomous mine hunting. That concept has been around for a few years, and there are programs to try and develop that kind of capability, because for obvious reasons, much better to get machines to do that work than to put our own people at risk. Detection systems for threats, including tracking our adversaries' nuclear submarines, all of those things are going to involve the kind of algorithms that we are talking about, and all of that development is live.
Thank you very much. Lord Sarfraz.
Yes, the professor talked about the hype around AI, and he also talked about open source systems. And so what has changed is, because of the hype around AI, the open source community has grown a whole lot. The number of individuals engaged with AI has grown a whole lot, and that is a difference from a few years ago. What that also means is that some of the cleverest technologists in the world are perhaps those who wouldn't pass security vetting to come into the MOD, let alone become defense contractors. And so I was wondering, Lord Sedwell, when you were NSA, what are the ways to engage with the best and brightest who would not be traditional folks that defense would engage with?
Well, I think that it's a great question, and actually one of the issues that we had was some of the best and brightest in this area, for their own ethical reasons, were unwilling to work on defensive systems. They were prepared to work with DeepMind, for example, on the development of some of their systems in medical and health and so on, but were not willing to work on defense. Actually, I think the Ukraine invasion, as it has more generally, has reminded everyone that properly managed, defence is a deeply ethical part of a democratic system, and I suspect therefore some of those attitudes have changed. I think in the end, it is simply the case we just have to be more thoughtful about how do we engage some of the best and brightest here. Of course, there's always going to be secure areas where nationality and vetting and so on matter, but those are a small fraction, to be honest, of much of what we're going to see in this area. And I suspect what we'll also see is defence, AI, machine learning, quantum computing, when that comes along in defence, will, as with most other algorithms, will probably start out by being 90% based on a civilian algorithm and then with defence enhancements rather than being based on something defensive from scratch. Pattern recognition, facial recognition, even targeting systems are based on algorithms that are used in completely different areas of civilian life, as I'm sure you know. So I think it's bound to be blended, I think.
Lord Fairfax.
Lord Seville, thank you. Just quickly, because I know you're short of time. If you could make one recommendation to the UK government in this whole area of AI-enabled weapon systems, what would it be? And if you have time, I have an unrelated question. Would you make a distinction? You differentiate, both you and Professor White distinguish between, to some extent, between offensive and defensive weapons. My question relates to nuclear weapons, defensive nuclear weapons. Would you have any comments in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think my one recommendation would be invest. For this country to punch our weight in military terms over the next 25 to 50 years, we should really be investing in this area. And that also means being able to invest probably in a way that has a higher risk appetite than traditionally government investment does, and we now have mechanisms to do that through the area and so on. Some of these new government investment opportunities. But I would say the recommendation is invest. This is the future, going to be the future of defence capability, and the UK needs to be at the forefront of that, just as the Prime Minister, and I should imagine almost any government would want us to be at the forefront of this in the civilian area. In terms of the nuclear deterrent, I think this goes absolutely to this question of at what point do you have control. I could imagine, as I think we've both described, having, in effect, an almost entirely autonomous ballistic missile defense system, particularly as hypersonic missiles become more of a threat because of the speed of response required. And that would be both the individual capabilities, whether that's sort of things like the Patriot system or directed energy weapons or whatever it might be, as well as the whole system, if you like, the corralling organisation of that system. I don't think in the offensive area you could ever contemplate that. We go to great efforts already to maintain positive political control within the deterrent. It's why every new Prime Minister, almost on their first day, has to write the letters of last resort to the nuclear submarine commanders, appoint nuclear deputies if they are incapacitated or incommunicado in a conflict, etc. And I think all of those controls would have to be maintained. That doesn't mean, of course, that AI algorithms wouldn't have a role at the tactical level in improving targeting and developing the systems and making them more accurate and more reliable and all of that. And actually, we already, of course, since the Test Ban Treaty, test all of our warheads essentially in a virtual environment, and that's AI as well. But I think in terms of the deployment of nuclear weapons and the deterrent as a whole, then maintaining positive political control, not just positive human control, but positive political control is essential.
Very much.
Thank you very much. Lord Horton has got a very brief question to conclude.
It's a quick and somewhat naughty one, because I know you're not speaking on behalf of BAE Systems. But in a world...
Yes, he is.
But in a world
No, I'm
where
not.
the future discriminator of military capability is more likely to be based on software, not hardware, would you share the view that the UK's defence industrial base is too dominated by defence primes whose primary source of income is the glacial replacement of generational platforms?
Yes or no? Yes or no?
Nice. I'm allowed 3 hours.
If I answer that question, I'm either probably going to be reprimanded by the House of Lords for a conflict of interest or sacked from the BAE board. I think you have a very fair point, and a challenge for defence generally. I think, and this is. I don't think one has to particularly get into the question of primes. Is how do we engage effectively and create the procurement systems, as you know, to engage effectively with some of the smaller, innovative software houses, particularly those being spun out of our universities, where there is, as Professor Dorrant-White said, some very, very impressive work. And I think just defence just needs to get much more sophisticated about that, and ensuring that the providers of the hardware platforms are open to plug and play of systems, not only AI software systems, but actually other systems. If someone develops a more sophisticated targeting system or a more sophisticated version of something else, they shouldn't be essentially suppressed by the primes. And that would be true, by the way, I think of all defence sectors.
Lord Sebel, thank you so much for your help. You've got us thinking in whole new areas of our inquiry, and we're extremely grateful to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lord Lisbane. Thank you. I'm glad to have participated.
Thank you.
Indeed. The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We have Professor Sharkey remotely, and Richard Boys and Dr. Paddy Walker with us in the committee room. Perhaps you could begin by very briefly introducing yourselves. Let's start with Richard Boys.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me in to give evidence to the committee. I'm Richard Moyes. I work for an organisation called Article 36, which is an NGO, civil society organisation based in the UK. It works on weapon policy and law-related issues. I have a background working, first of all, in landmine clearance and explosive ordnance disposal operations, but then subsequently on developing new international policy and legal instruments on a range of weapon systems. And I currently coordinate Stop Killer Robots, which is an international civil society partnership that's concerned with the issue of autonomy in weapon systems, which of course intersects very closely with issues around AI in weapon systems. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Walker.
Thank you again for having me as well. I'm here today. I've got a PhD in a very particular part of the field that you have under discussion, concerned on the challenges to the deployment of autonomous weapon systems. My postdoctoral work focuses really on the behavioural, the soft, if you can call it that, leadership implications of removing human supervision in lethal engagements. By way of context, I'm ex-military. cavalry officer of no note a long time ago. I'm a senior fellow at Buckingham's Humanities Research Institute, and just down the road here I am an associate fellow at RUSI. I, until a couple of weeks ago, was co-chair of Human Rights Watch, the NGO Human Rights Watch, their London committee.
I'm sure the skins provided a very good foundation for your defence knowledge. Professor Sharkey.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having this as well as having me. I'm very pleased to see this development at the House of Lords. Now, I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Sheffield, a professor of artificial intelligence and robotics, and also professor of public engagement. And I started really writing publicly, it was first of all in The Guardian, warning about these autonomous weapons in 2007. And I'm now chairman of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, a group of scholars that started in 2009, and we're a founding member of the campaign to stop killer robots. That has been going for 10 years at the United Nations, and very depressing, I must say.
Thank you very much. As you know, the format of the meeting, it's being broadcast, and after the meeting you will get a transcript so that you can correct any errors that may have crept in. They very rarely do. But Lord Greycott, would you like to start us off?
Yes, it's a question about definition. Pretty early on in our inquiry, we found there were a number of different definitions of autonomous weapon systems. We even had one of our witnesses actually who said it didn't matter that there wasn't any agreed definition on what was meant by it. But it certainly seems to me, and I think probably to the committee as well, that clearly if you're going to have any kind of international agreement on anything connected with them, you need to know what you're talking about, i.e. you need to have a definition. And allied to that, because so much of this discussion repeatedly really has been to do with hypotheticals, we'd be very grateful if you can give us any examples of autonomous weapon systems that are currently in use that you're aware of, and some estimate as to what has been their impact.
Who would like to start? Dr. Walker.
It's fine. I'll start on the definitional piece and then I'll hand over to Noel and Richard on the second piece. I mean, I have some sympathy with your previous participant going, perhaps at 40,000 feet, that precise definitions, we shouldn't get too hung up on them. And I'll go to that, I'll try to occupy that 40,000 feet position by saying that my definition of a robotic weapon here, an autonomous weapon, would be that it has the ability to sense and act unilaterally depending upon how they're programmed. So for me, the issue is agency and where that agency lies. And agency, as far as I'm concerned, is the action or intervention, the control, the responsibility that the in-field commander, wherever that is, whoever has allowed these machines to be used, producing a specific effect. And I'm sure we'll return to the issue later on, but it's that agency profusion, so a weapon system perhaps that has agency with its automatic target recognition or somewhere within the whole piece of the weapon. You may have meaningful human control up top, but down below you have that profusion. And also that agency dilution that we then started to have the problems because the user cannot understand, can't comprehend necessarily what effects are to be delivered by that weapon system.
Professor Sharkey, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I would take a slightly simpler definition because as a scientist I go along with Einstein's dictum that we should make our explanations as simple as possible but no simpler. And I would say that really the United States started this off with a kind of one-liner, which is a weapon system that once activated can select targets and kill them without further human supervision. Now, the IRC, I mean, most of the states now have some version of this with a little bit of elaboration, and including the ICRC. The important thing here is really, for all of us, is the critical functions. It's not just autonomy of the weapon system, but it's the critical functions of target identification and delegation of the decision to kill. And for me, it's this delegation of the decision to kill that is a key factor.
And Mr. Moyes, are you on the same page with this?
Yeah, broadly, I think. And I mean, Noel there mentioned the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they have published a definition on this. And I think our orientation to this subject matter would follow the same basic conceptual terms. When we talk about autonomous weapon systems, specifically that form of words, we're talking about weapon systems that use sensors to determine specifically where and specifically when force should be applied. So the human commander, having put that weapon into operation in an area, it is then up to the weapon system, it's then determined by the weapon system as to specifically when and where force is applied, because that system has identified something using its sensors that matches the onboard target profile. So that basic mechanical structure of sensors determining where and when force is applied is for us the foundational question here. So there's all sorts of other potential areas of what might be called autonomy in weapon systems. But for this issue, autonomous weapons, we're talking about specifically the target identification process or the location time of force occurring being determined by the sensor array. And then coming on to the other part of the question on systems that work in this way, I mean, we believe that there should be additional regulations in these areas, prohibitions and regulations, but we're not suggesting that all systems that work in this way should be prohibited, because there are already a large number of systems that function broadly within this structural framework, particularly defensive systems, missile defense systems, where they're monitoring an area of sky, and when a radar signature matches the program profiles of the weapon system, they respond to it. That kind of missile defense system falls within this structure of operation. But for us, it's being done in a effectively controlled manner. More of an area of concern is where you have systems like perhaps the Harop loitering munition, which can operate over a significant period of time, flying over an area, and has the potential to then, within that area, be seeking out targets that match a certain profile. Our concern is that as those operations expand over greater areas of space and longer periods of time, and where the target profiles themselves are increasingly complex, the ability of a user to predict effectively what that system will do becomes diffuse, and that's where we think we need constraints to ensure that human control can be applied. Thanks.
Yes.
If I could just come in there, I hadn't finished that part of the question, if I may, about which weapons are available today. Is that okay?
Yeah, do. Carry on.
Okay, thank you. I just left that for the definitional bit. Since I started on this, there have been a number of platforms that have been touted as being autonomous, although they're still being developed today. There were systems, tanks, for instance, in China and Russia. There were, I won't go into the details too much because you want to know what's happening now, but a number of platforms on the sea and in the air. The United States developed the X-47B, for instance, a fighter jet with a lot more reach than their usual F-16 and their F-35s on aircraft carriers, so for use in the Pacific. So there's so many of these have been developed. And particularly in China now, the developments are towards swarms of small autonomous robots. Now, how far they are developed, it's very difficult to find out. We do get intelligence, but we don't know for sure. One system that was developed that's worth noting was a sniper detector. So it's called the Red Owl, and that would detect a sniper using differential between two speakers. You know, you use sound differential, so it could swing around immediately and shoot that sniper. But the problem there has been, it hasn't been deployed because the problem has been that ricochet, it will fire at anything when you get ricochet. This is one of the dangers of warfare. It's all very well in theory, but once you get ricochet, it will start shooting. If you have one of your own people fire at the sniper, it will immediately possibly shoot them as well. So that hasn't been deployed. But today we know we've got the Cargo 2, developed in Turkey, and that's apparently fully autonomous. I haven't tested these things myself. Apparently fully autonomous, but has it been tested in Syria? We believe so. We believe it's been tested against the within Turkey itself, but we have no real evidence for this as yet. And then one of the most worrying things that most people just develop the platforms. Ever since the campaign started and press picked up on it, everybody says, well, of course it will have human control. But Russia is different. Kalashnikov have been openly testing a targeting system for a few years now, perhaps 4 or 5, and New York Times were allowed to go and film that system. It works on machine learning, so it learns targets and fires directly on them. Now, this is a generalized system that can appear in anything, and I know that the Kalashnikov have developed a couple of drone systems that are being used in Ukraine at the moment, and they tout them as having these systems on board. And their words are they were good for target acquisition and hitting targets. That's their words, whatever the Russian for that is. So these things. This is the what's it called? Let me just look at my notes to tell you what they're called, because I'm not too good at remembering these. The Kub-Bla drone and the Lancet drone. Now, Ukraine also have the, excuse my pronunciation, Bayraktar drone, which is also supposed to have fully autonomous modes. But to follow,
it may be that Hansard will need to make further inquiries of you after our session.
Yes, certainly.
Lord Greenwood, do you want to come back?
I would like to, yes. I still am not clear. Maybe this is to Richard Moyes, who said there are weapon systems in existence at present that have degrees of autonomy, which you wouldn't want to you wouldn't want to ban or get some agreement on banning. So, can you give us any examples of existing weapons systems with degrees of autonomy that you would want to see banned? And I suppose the same question I'd be putting to Professor Sharkey. I just want to get some clarity. I want to see something which, a piece of kit at the moment, which is unacceptable, or at least which you hope would become unacceptable. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get a grip on precisely what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we would want to see prohibitions on systems that can't be used with meaningful human control or anti-personnel systems functioning in this way. So in terms of systems that can't be used with meaningful human control, I'm not sure that there's any straightforwardly now, but if we had systems that used machine learning where they were continuing to learn their target profiles after they'd been put into operation, that for us would straightforwardly be incompatible with a system being effectively controlled by the operator. Similarly, if a system couldn't be constrained in its duration and its area of functioning, then that would be prohibited. I think systems like the Harop and these loitering munition systems are on the boundaries of what we would consider to be acceptable, and I think for us we need to draw prohibitions there now on the controllability to prevent a movement into that area in the future. On the anti-personnel side, there are already sentry gun systems on the Korean border that have the capability of targeting people autonomously. They're not used in that mode as present, but as far as we're concerned, we should put in place a line against allowing systems that would be used in that mode in the future. I think these days there hasn't been a general adoption of systems that autonomously target people. And I think if we as a society can put in place a barrier to that now, then we should do so, because I think it doesn't bode well for the protection of humanity in conflict, for troops as well as for civilians, if we allow machines that can just automatically process people and kill them. So those sentry guns, if they were used in an anti-personnel mode, we would call for them to be prohibited. And certain existing systems, if their target profiles were developed in particularly complex ways, we would also consider it to be prohibited.
Can I just introduce one other sort of line here, and that is that to my thinking, there is a material step change in both hardware and software that is required before these machines may be deployed. May be deployed from a laws of armed combat perspective, but also from a user's perspective, because there are gaping chasms in the technology, be it automatic target recognition. I'm sure we'll come on to data later on. Ways of backfilling for missing data, duplicatory data, contradictory data, data that's obsolete. I listened briefly to your previous speaker in the last session talking about these stochastic models and prediction and statistics backing these things up. They are incredibly, incredibly fragile. So I still think there is generally, from that question, this sort of revolution in expectation. We've seen this thing with, on Terminator or whatever, or we've seen it as in a presentation or in a publication. So therefore, they exist. They don't necessarily exist, and the other danger that I think comes from that is norm changing as well. So suddenly it becomes acceptable to consider, to start thinking that we are going to have lethal engagements with no meaningful human control. And as Noel said, that point of delegating the decision to kill to an algorithm suddenly becomes possible because I've seen it in a film or whatever, so therefore these things exist. And I'm not sure that's so.
If we look at the existing weapons, we can perhaps throw some light on the question that's being asked here. Obviously, there are a number of what you can call SARMO weapons. That means weapons that sense and react to military objects. So, for instance, the Phalanx, which I'm sure you all know, is one of those. The Iron Dome system. So systems that are used to shoot down military objects or prevent swarming, they have gone wrong at times. But let's look just briefly here at the Mantis NB, which is a German weapon. Now, this weapon is used for shooting down mortar shells, which is very, very useful, obviously, in warfare. So it can shoot down these these mortars very quickly. But if you look at the small print of what the manufacturers say, and I'm a person who reads small print, the small print talks about the same system could also be used for locating the sniper, the person who fired the mortar shell, the location of the mortar where it came from. They could be located and immediately autonomously targeted, so they could fire a rocket or whatever weapon they wanted to at that person. Now, in one case, you've got the SARMO weapon that's shooting down military objects. That's okay. That's defensive. We need that kind of protection. But then when we turn to the other side of just firing a weapon autonomously at where the mortar was, I don't know how fast they get out of the way, autonomously, without looking to see if there are civilians present. Is this in the middle of a village or a town? Where was it fired from? So this would be an indiscriminate use of a weapon. And I would say that's where you draw the line completely between an autonomous weapon and a SARMO weapon. And it's the same with the loitering munitions. They're what I would call a cusp weapon. They use radar to determine where an anti-aircraft installation is and take out that anti-aircraft installation. But the assumption here is that radar is connected to an anti-aircraft installation. It could be on top of a hospital roof or anything else. So it's not entirely discriminatory. But the Mantis NB with that extension would be in the realm of an autonomous weapon. It's being delegated with the decision to kill.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, in a moment, ask Lord Clement Jones to move us into a new area of criteria. But I think Lord Hamilton
very quick one.
Has got a very brief question each.
This is for Richard Moyes. He says that he would certainly ban an autonomous system that killed invading troops on the Korean border. Would he still hold that view if the North Koreans developed an identical system which did the same thing?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that the issue for us here is drawing a line against adopting any systems that automatically just process people for being killed. There's something fundamentally dehumanizing about reducing people to simply points of data and well, I'm going to use the word processing again, but just processing them for death without a human being involved in engaging with the decision to apply force to a specific person. So I think that as a society, we have the technological capability to have systems that function in that way now, and we've had that technological capability for quite a long time, and we've managed not to choose to operate in that way. And I think that with all of these things, if we can establish the boundaries now that we want to protect and preserve, it's better to do it now than to try to pull back from the use of systems that once they've been adopted. So whether that's normatively or whether that's in terms of technological investment in certain systems. So I feel like strengthening that normative line now would be socially preferable for all of us. I'm sure from a military perspective, of course, you can make a case as to why this would be a useful asset, but it's very much the same case as the anti-personnel landmine. I mean, we're looking at a similar dynamic of functioning there, and in the end, there's a sort of grave social risk in deciding, I think, that machines can simply determine who to apply force to, or simply to apply force to everybody within a particular area. There's a risk that just pushes the burden onto the civilian population to exclude themselves from those zones. So.
Lord Sarfraz.
I think it was answered, but just we've had a lot of evidence, particularly written evidence, on the risks and why these things can be bad, right? But you gave the example of a landmine, which is an autonomous weapon system. Now, if you apply AI to it and make it a smart landmine, which is much safer, much better, is that an example of this technology being actually used to make autonomous systems better, safer for the world? Dr. Walker?
Not my bailiwick, I'm afraid, really.
Phil, that's...
Sorry.
Professor Sharkey.
No, I think Richard should answer this since he was the culprit.
I can see the buck is passing very efficiently from hand to hand. Mr. Moyes.
No, yes, he has good answers.
Anti-personnel landmines are prohibited under the Mine Ban Treaty, and within those discussions, there were certain lines of argument that were rejected about adding additional technological capabilities to landmines in order to make them somehow acceptable. It was decided with respect to anti-personnel mines that they should be prohibited. On the other hand, I'm not arguing that within the space of autonomous weapons in general, there is no capacity for AI to perform functions that are useful. Our concerns with AI functions specifically within this space, I think derive more from issues of the complexity of target profile development and the potential of systems to use target profiles that can't be effectively understood by the operator of the system, or that change subsequent to the system being used, which is another version of the same thing, because the operator then doesn't fully understand the implications of that system. So I don't think I'm arguing for a complete removal of AI capabilities from all aspects of weapon systems. It's simply that the users of systems need to be able to sufficiently understand the system that they're using, and they need to be able to understand what will trigger an application of force by that system in order to make reasonable determinations about the likely outcomes of using that system in a specific context. In the relation to the issue of anti-personnel weapon systems specifically, if the argument is going to be that AI will allow us to distinguish between civilians and combatants in some way, then I think this is extremely fraught ground and extremely dangerous ground. It's dangerous on legal terms because ultimately the legal targetability of individual people is contextually determined. It isn't based on some intrinsic physically identifiable characteristics. Even if you're carrying a gun, it doesn't make you automatically targetable in combat. And then if we start to develop target profiles based on data sets and algorithms, then there's a potential for bias to come into that, such that we start to identify, perhaps accidentally, perhaps deliberately, people of certain skin color or certain age and gender characteristics as being combatants. Already in the US drone program, we've seen that people killed in the vicinity of a drone strike, if they're men between the ages of 16 and 70, say, they may be considered to be military casualties rather than civilian casualties. But that doesn't actually align with the legal determinations as whether people are targetable or not. So once we bring AI into this process of dividing up between civilians and combatants, I think we run a very grave risk of prejudicially bringing to bear social biases in those determinations. And anyway, we're undertaking a process that I think is legally extremely fraught.
Lord Clement Jones.
We've started answering the question about what is it about the use of AI in weapon systems that warrants additional concern or scrutiny above what is required for non-AI powered weapons. But I just want to provoke you with the comments of some of our earlier witnesses. I mean, one of them said this is just AI is really just the enhanced use of algorithms. He also said that this is AI is really simply applied statistics. And then our other witness said a use of AI in weapons is not as significant as nuclear. I mean, in that context, what are we really concerned about AI? Is it, and I think one of them also said that this is really only in circumstances where you hand over command and control to AI. So what is the essence of the concern? Perhaps I could start with Professor Sharkey.
Yes, certainly. I don't have any objection to what you just said that other people have said. I don't see how that has bearing on it. At the moment, yes, AI is mainly governed by statistical pattern recognition, which is trendily called machine learning, which the word learning causes a lot of problems, really. But it is statistical pattern recognition. In fact, it's parameter estimation for statistical pattern recognition, but unfortunately, that just doesn't catch headlines. And that does not help at all with the uncertainty in this. Now, the laws of war, I think the last major upgrade was 1977, and that was the Geneva Convention, Additional Protocol 1. Now, in those days, I think we were getting things like the Xbox, the little pet personal computers. There was no idea at that time that computers might be used, that artificial intelligence might be developed to take control of weapons. And so when you read the Geneva Convention, you'll find that it doesn't talk about humans doing this or humans doing that or humans being in control of this or that. And it doesn't talk about it because it's a default. It's completely considered to be human. So at least it needs that much upgrade, if nothing else, before it's IHL compatible. But really, the problem here is that can this comply? Can we guarantee compliance with the laws of war? With proportionality, with the principle of distinction, with the principle of proportionality, and I would say, and precaution, I would say absolutely not. We cannot guarantee this to happen. And one of the reasons for this is, if you look at machine learning, I mean, it's trained from examples, and you can give it billions of examples. Where the examples for warfare are coming, I don't know. It will not be trained on the battlefield, because that could result in, it can take millions of iterations to learn something, and you don't want that many people to die while it's learning. But you train it off the battlefield, and then you test it. But you test it on generalization, and generalization essentially means examples that it hasn't seen before. Now, these examples will fall in with the general remit. For instance, if you have got a chess game, you will train it on many, many games, and then you'll give it novel games, and it will work on those, but they're inside the same domain. Now, the trouble with the battlefield is it's replete with unanticipated circumstances. I mean, when I say replete with it, it's possibly an infinite number of things that can happen, number of tricks, number of spoofs, just number of different things that could happen. It's so obvious, like US Marines, for instance, catching a lot of insurgents in an alleyway. They were raised their guns about to shoot them. This was in Afghanistan. They noticed they were carrying a coffin. So they lowered their guns, took off their helmets, bowed their heads and let them pass. An autonomous weapon would probably have just killed them all. And if you trained an autonomous weapon to not kill people carrying coffins, everybody, all insurgents would be carrying coffins. I mean, it's quite sort of an odd thing. So we have this idea, and then I could go on about this for hours, and I mustn't, because
we are quite short of time, Professor Sharkey.
Yes, okay. Well, let me just give you one more thing. When we look at the laws of war, we look at what's big thing that's being pushed by the United States, and rightly so, is Article 36 reviews. Now, review of the reviews shown that only about 12 nations are actually capable of carrying out Article 36 reviews. Article 36 reviews, just in case you have, I'm sure you all know what they are, but they're for testing weapons. So, for instance, you have a new missile or a new bomb, you will look at the kinetic energy it produces, that kind of thing. Now, Article 36, using it, and I really promote the use of Article 36, but using it for an autonomous weapon is almost impossible, because you can test it as much as you want in the laboratory. You need to do empirical testing. There is currently no formal way of testing an autonomous weapon, no formal way, and none on the horizon, although a lot of people have tried to, this applies to autonomous systems in general. So what you have to do is test it empirically. You can test it in simulation, you can test it all you want, but you do not know how it will behave in the battlefield, and particularly against other military systems. I'll leave it there because there's time shortage.
Thank you. And Mr. Moyes?
Yeah, I think I've made a few comments already that cover aspects of this. I would just note again, distinction between autonomous weapon systems and AI in weapon systems that I made at the beginning. I think key problems really are the issue of control for me. If a human, under the laws of war, as I think Noel was pointed to, international humanitarian law applies to people. It's people who have the legal obligations to fulfill the legal requirements. And it's people who are going to be held accountable for the outcomes of their actions. And I think the concern for us is the ways in which within autonomous weapon systems, certain AI functions in the development of target profiles or the identification of targets can basically impede the ability of a user to adequately be able to predict what that system is going to do in a particular context of use. And it's that human user who has the obligation to determine what are the likely balance of civilian harms and military utilities that will come from an attack. And it's that human user who has the responsibility ultimately is going to be held accountable for what happens from their actions. So we need to be able to maintain that chain of accountability through the technology that's used, and there's a risk that certain AI systems in certain functions lose track of that. I mentioned additionally these issues about potentially targeting people and the processing there, so I won't reopen that section.
Dr. Walker.
So I would agree with your previous speakers about the enhanced algorithms, applied statistics, but the key distinction here, I think was brought out by Noel, is that you are slaving that to the delegation of the decision to kill. And so I would have a handful of technical problems that I think, if I can just quickly address. And first of all, everything in an autonomous weapon, because it is autonomous, you can't speak to it, it is doing its own thing. All of the commander's vision and battle plan has got to be captured in code. And it is that problem of coding to capture ambiguity and intangibles and context and situational awareness and all of those things that are very difficult to abstract and don't have nice clean edges, that I think makes machine learning a difficult technical spine upon which to base autonomous weapons. After all, the whole issue, as we've somewhat discussed, revolves around data, and we've talked about obsolete data and all of the fact that it doesn't arrive at the right time, and it's not nice and clean and very easy to spoof, as Noel said. Training these weapons systems will require unbelievably specific data training sets. These don't exist. To the extent that they do exist, they are, a country will have them, they are restricted, confidential, and I like the piece that Noel says about how a battlefield is incredibly fluid, dynamic, absolutely adversarial, prone to spoof. Data, as a result, is a very inappropriate backbone. So if that training data set thinks that a tank moves obliquely, thinking of the 5th Royal Enniskillen Dragoon Guards, Mr. Chairman, that a tank is grey, has a large turret coming out of it, it's got a particular RF signature. So how do I defeat that on my right flank? Well, I'm going to paint my turret pink or whatever, and we've all seen examples of less than 1.05% of a pixelated picture. If you change that, it won't be a banana, it'll become a pineapple or whatever. So these are enduring technical challenges where some work has been done by way of GUI chips and by way of enhanced processing power of computers. So there looks to have been some improvements over the last couple of decades, but we are still essentially using the same backbone to try and crack these problems. And the last thing that I'd like to talk about is, so we talked a lot about sensed data. So the machine is going along, the weapon is going along, and it is sensing its data. Well, there's really difficult issues here. So how often is it taking data from its sensors? How often is it polling its sensors? It's incredibly processing heavy. On the other hand, if you don't do it every second, every minute or whatever, then there is the issue of obsolescence. And also, no work is being done on any university bench at the moment about anchoring, the degree to which you change the initial representation of your autonomous weapon with regards to the newly sensed data that has come in. Do you do it? So it's degrees. So if it's going down, if a machine is going down a road and it comes through a pothole and it has to move 30 degrees to the right, does it always have to move 30 degrees to the right? It's this sort of the mediation of newly sensed data into representations, which no one is particularly talking about. And then the last thing I just would bring to bear is some of the operational issues about these autonomous weapons. You set them off on a Tuesday, one goes behind a hill and one's going to your right flank. The following day, they will be very, very different machines because they're benefiting from experience, they're machine learning, they're updating their representation, as I talked about before. So how, as the local commander, are you to understand the assets that you have at your disposal at that point? One's had to be patched. It's got a new software update, but that one was behind the hill. You don't know if it actually received that. Noel's point about verification and validation and testing and predictability. So do you have a robust system? And so these are some of the technical issues, I think, that come from that question.
Thank you. A brief question from Lord Brown, and then I'll come to the Lord Bishop of Coventry.
So, Professor Sharkey twice made reference to the additional protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Convention, and in particular, I mean, he didn't mince his words about Article 36, and the requirement to conduct legal reviews of all new weapon systems, I think, means and methods of warfare to determine whether the use is prohibited by international law. So he doesn't believe that that's possible to the standard that would be necessary. So I just want to explore, given that we've got Richard Moyes here, I want to explore with Richard some other things about Article 36, because we were told by witnesses from the Department of Defence, Article 36 and our consistent compliance with it was one of the guardrails that would ensure that our weapon systems would be compliant with international humanitarian law. So the history of Article 36 is that there's 174, I think, countries who signed Articles 35 and 36, and only 8 of them who appear to carry out these processes to ensure conformity. Thankfully, the United Kingdom, which is the country that we're most concerned about, is one of them. Of the 6 of them, 2 of them don't publish anything about the regulation and the review. The US does, and we in France are the 2 that don't publish anything. So there's nothing there's nothing in the public domain that shows whether we've conformed or not, or how we did it, or what the regulation was. So, I mean, I'm interested, Richard, in whether you agree with Professor Sharkey that essentially AI-enabled weapons, and in particular autonomous ones, and even more particularly lethal autonomous ones, present a challenge that we can't meet in relation to our Article 36 obligations. And can you confirm, in fact, that it's hitherto it's not been possible for anybody to independently assess whether the United Kingdom are actually conforming with this, because they publish nothing about it?
Yeah. If you could make your answer fairly brief, because I'm afraid the clock is very much against us.
And there's a lot that could be said. Broadly, yes. I mean, I think Article 36 reviews are important, and I think in addressing issues of autonomy and weapon system, we're going to need to continue to have states reviewing at a national level the systems that they develop. So I don't want to push to one side weapon review processes altogether. But Article 36 weapon reviews are obligations to assess whether your weapon system would be legal or illegal under the existing law. Well, from an orientation where I don't think that the existing law actually provides the clarity of guidelines that are needed to shape the future of technologies on this issue, then automatically those review processes themselves are insufficient, because I believe that the existing legal framework is insufficient. And they're insufficient, I think, in a few key areas, particularly because there is no clarity that we need to have adequate understanding of the systems that we use, and that has some sort of benchmarks to it, or that the users of systems need to be able to sufficiently constrain the duration and the geographical area of the systems that they use. And I think these kind of tests are fairly sort of simple in their conceptual basis, but they would give states at a national level an augmented ability to evaluate, well, does this type of AI challenge or enable the understanding of the user in relation to the operation of that system. So I think without those additional tests, we're not interrogating those AI systems effectively. Or we might be at our own national level, just because of good practice on our parts. We don't know because it's not public, but certainly no other states know, and we have no ability to ensure that other states are doing the same, which is another aspect of this, that because this is purely national and often secret, there's no sort of norm-building mechanism at work here within the wider international community. So we're not setting shared standards, we're all just going off and doing our things, and basically it's an appeal to trust us at a national level. And we may have more or less trust for different states around the world in terms of how they would orientate to these questions. So,
Bishop.
Thank you, Lord. My questions were on a very similar line, so I don't want to repeat them. But am I right in... Well, it sounds as if Mr. Moyes was saying that international humanitarian law needs further interpretation, I think, as the MOD says, in order to really apply it to AI and weapon systems and guidelines and so on. Is that, I mean, am I right in understanding that, rather than saying that it needs another significant development in it? Is it sort of sufficient as it is with a layer of interpretation? And do our other witnesses think the same?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. I think we think it needs additional legal augmentation, but in relation to the obligations on commanders in attacks, we think there should be an obligation on the users of systems to sufficiently understand the systems that they use and to understand what will trigger an application of force by that system. And there should be an obligation to be able to sufficiently limit the duration of a system's functioning and the area of its functioning so that they can apply their existing obligations under the law. So those rules would be rules on use of systems that it could be interpreted as simply enabling what the law already says. It's just that the law doesn't articulate these terms within itself. A little bit, as Noel said, when the law was drafted in 1977, these issues were not a concern. And I think in civilian society, we've acknowledged that we need new rules on automated decision-making in the civilian space because our existing legal structures don't fully rise to that. The only additional area I'd say is on the anti-personnel line. That's a more distinct line, less of a straightforward interpretation of existing rules and more of a precautionary, sort of socially based orientation to say we want to prevent a development of harm in these areas. So that rule would be on a slightly different footing in relation to the existing law.
We're scheduled to finish at 12 o'clock. Would it be particularly inconvenient for anybody if we went on for a further 15 minutes?
I have a difficulty at 12:15.
Right. 12:14 in that case.
Can I just add one point
Please,
to
Dr.
Richard's point about rules on use, which I think is a useful construct? It's not just constraints, therefore. It might also be positive obligations on the in-field commander that they know what's happening at the target end or whatever it is, and some of the targeting profile considerations that Rich has already detailed. So it's constraints but also positive obligations that would be part of that rule set.
May I, Lord Chair, just seek one clarification? It sounds as if you would be assured by what we've recently been told by the MOD in a witness statement that there remains a need for a conscious, accountable human actor to be satisfied in order to be satisfied that the relevant legal requirements of that decision are being made. So that's sort of built into policy. So no doubt you'll have some reassurance from that, but not convinced by it because of lack of transparency, as Lord Brown was indicating. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think those are needs. I think where I would differ from the UK civil servants on these issues is about the need to move this to the level of international rulemaking on the matter. I can't, of course, can't interpret their position exactly, but I don't feel like conceptually that I'm a million miles away from UK officials on these matters. It's more about politically how do we position ourselves in the international landscape.
Lord Clement Jones.
I don't think the answers to this will take very long, but I asked the question, to what extent is the UK government a leading voice in conversations on international regulation, and where could it improve? Professor Sharkey.
I think Richard Moyse has a very good answer to this in terms of regulation. But I would say myself that, we could be a leading voice if we were to step up and take a lead. But at the moment they don't. They tend to just go with what the United States says. I often see them huddled in a corner talking together. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I'm not sure that that's a permissible thing to say. But we need
You'll probably damage US-UK relationships irretrievably now.
Yes, I might
But
do.
you are entirely covered by parliamentary privilege.
I'll just make one very quick comment because others have more important things to say about it, I think. I think one of the problems in the UK is that all the time since the beginning, since there have been parliamentary questions, it's always, we will not be developing autonomous weapons. Therefore, we don't need to have a prohibition or support a prohibition. Well, I would call that extremely blinkered. It's like, there's no other community out there. We'll develop them and we'll be very responsible, we'll be very safe. But will others be very responsible and very safe? And that really worries me because we need to stand up and stop the others who are not responsible and safe from developing their weapons. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I think the UK could do significantly more in terms of international leadership on the issue. I don't know to what extent it's going to be apparent from the evidence you've heard already, but there's actually quite a substantially developed international policy conversation on this issue, and there is a broad centre of opinion as to where a legal regulation on this issue should go. I feel like when you look at the UK, if you look at the integrated review on global Britain and the defence in a competitive age, the UK in those documents talks quite a bit about being at the forefront of norm setting and rule setting, and that this is important to our position in the international landscape. And frankly, I mean, this is perhaps I'm taking off my Article 36 and stuck to the robots hat here to say something a bit more at a national political level. But I think I broadly agree with that sort of posture from a national perspective about the UK's role in the world. We just don't see it in practice in terms of actually building the partnerships and driving the conversations forward. And although I think the civil servants on this issue have certainly been good to work with, and I think there's a lot of thoughtful work going on there, definitely don't see political leadership on that side. Our assessment would be that there's going to be probably going to be a resolution at the UN General Assembly later this year in October that's a resolution that will probably be inviting the UN Secretary General to consult states internationally on this issue. So this is getting out of the rather narrow conversations that have been in Geneva and inviting all states to make their views known on the matter. It's likely that that resolution will not contain detailed formulations about what the outcome of this should be. So it's not a prejudicial formulation. This is something that the UK would straightforwardly be able to support from my perspective, and I think it's a key test of whether they want to be a dynamic actor on this issue, whether they take a leadership role on that, whether they encourage other states to join that resolution, or whether they hold back and try to keep this conversation actually in a rather stifled pool in Geneva where it's been for the last 10 years. So I think I'm thinking that there is a concrete test of UK leadership that could come in the next few months.
Thank you. Dr. Walker, do you agree?
So I think I'd agree with that. I'd be a little bit more outspoken, which I can be. I think the UK should understand it's not in our interest to leave international law and norm setting to others. So the CCW, where this happens in the United Nations, is absolutely a case in point. I think I first went there after Human Rights Watch published their rather pejoratively named Killer Robots report in 2012, so that's 11 years ago. And in this institution, which is where all of the discussion that Richard has articulated takes place, it's Russia who's deciding on the agenda's ambition, Russia deciding on the scope, Russia deciding on the pace. And so my view would be, how can this be strategically valuable to the UK to, whether it is, as Noel suggests, huddling in a corner with the US, or not putting a best front foot forward. So my recommendation would be certainly to adopt the October initiative, but also I think to step up leadership on the matter and perhaps move that negotiation of a statutory instruments from the CCW to the United Nations General Assembly.
Thank you very much. I'm now looking to Lord Treesman and Lord Sarfraz to take us into the world of future-proofing.
Well, I'll do my best, Lord Chairman, to do this very briefly, and therefore I hope I can apologise in advance, but the questions will become cruder in order to make them brief. I think all of our witnesses, and particularly Mr. Moyes, have emphasised the need for either revised or new regulation in these areas for all sorts of reasons. Rapid technological advance is one of them. Greater clarity on the guidelines we need, some greater legal scaffolding, because the current legal scaffolding, if I can put it this way, is inadequate. And I'm aware that there have been a number of examples of people who've tried to future-proof by getting together in groups which have considered what the variables are in the future, shouldered it commercially very successfully over a number of years. RUSI has done it, Chatham House has done it. We even had a unit which was set up in the late lamented department, DIAS, in Innovation Universities and Skills, led by Sir Keith O'Nyans before he went on to Imperial College. In all of those cases, the future-proofing effort was abandoned as A, not of sufficient interest to anybody, and secondly, too difficult. It all got put in a box which was called too difficult. How can we get to a point where we try to future-proof successfully? Sorry if I put that rather crudely, but that's really the question.
We know exactly what you mean, Lord Treesman. Who will go first on that? Mr. Moyes.
Yep. I think it's a key consideration is to make sure the rules that you adopt are orientating to the future, because ultimately technologies will continue to develop in these areas. So we have to have a rule set that is sufficiently flexible and sufficiently open to be workable in that context. From our perspective, I think the key is to formulate rules that are based on human principles and human use requirements. So the kind of rules I was talking about before, to suggest that a user needs to efficiently understand the system that they're using and what will trigger an application of force. That's a rule that is based on what the human needs to be able to do, and it isn't tied to specific technological configurations. And I think that's something that we should avoid. We shouldn't write rules that talk about specific forms of AI and specific sort of computer configurations and the like. We want rules that that specify what we as people want to see protected and retained in the use of force. And that for me is the understanding, the sufficient ability to constrain the use of a system so that you're making meaningful human judgments about what is going to happen. And again, in the case of the anti-personnel prohibition, it's a prohibition based on systems targeting people. It's not based on systems functioning with some specific technological configuration. It would be more flowing from the human. So I think that's the core of it for me, is have rules that specify what we as people want to retain in the future in conflict, and recognizing that there may need to be guidelines and grey literature that is providing more detail about how certain specific technical forms match up to that. But the rules we adopt should be at a broad and human level, I think.
Professor Sharkey.
Yes, I agree with Richard. I'll just be very brief. Throughout the whole of AI governance in other areas other than this, the idea of future-proofing is focus on the end users, on the people who will be subject to these systems, and don't focus on the technology. So focus on protecting people. That way you can future-proof, I believe.
Dr. Walker.
Yeah, I haven't got much to add. I'd go back up to that 40,000 feet that we started at the beginning of our session here, meaningful human control. And I know that when you're sitting in the CCW and you have China and Russia talking for 4 days about exact what meaningful means and where the control is. But nevertheless, meaningful human control and that targeting profiles piece. So, that it's one target, it's not rolling target, it's controlled by duration, it's controlled by space. So I'd agree with Noel that it's focusing on the end user. I'd agree with Richard that it's those positive obligations about understanding for somebody who's actually using this, using the kit, and being able to understand what the effect of the weapon is going to be. If you have that in a bundle, then all of the technology noise that happens underneath is less important.
Lord Safraz.
When we speak about regulation, it feels like we're focusing on international law primarily, right? Is there a role for domestic regulation as well that you feel should be addressed?
Yes.
And how do we make sure we don't regulate ourselves out of business?
As you will gather, there is a huge premium on brevity at this point.
Yes, I think it should be led by the international legal structure. I think there are challenges to regulating legally at a national level on these issues when you don't know where the international legal structure is going to land. I think this is an issue where I expect there to be an international legal instrument within the next 3, 4, 5 years. It'll be quicker if the UK works on it. It'll be slower, but it'll happen if the UK doesn't work on it. I think it's a challenge to regulate nationally on this legally without knowing where that framework is going to settle at this stage.
Dr. Walker.
I agree.
Professor Sharkey, thank you. Dr. Walker.
Yes, I agree. It's an international forum matter. In terms of regulating your way out of being competitive in this space, or commercially competitive in this space as well, I think that is less of an issue if you can, which we must do, establish that the broad framework. Lots can happen underneath. When I said the technology is less important, what I should have said is that technology can develop along, but within that framework. So I don't think that's necessarily a consideration, would be my view.
I think the final question comes from Baroness Hodgson, and it has been specially designed to allow of a one-sentence answer.
Absolutely. So, what one recommendation would you make to the UK government?
I'm going to start that. I would listen to Richard Moyes.
I would recommend they join the UN General Assembly resolution in October on autonomous weapons.
I agree. I agree with what Richard said, but I would recommend that they step up to the mark and show leadership by acknowledging that we need a prohibition on very dangerous autonomous weapon systems.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. You contributed greatly to our inquiry within really cruel time constraints. So we are extremely grateful to all three of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.